Warning. I chain smoke and I say fuck a lot. But I accept myself for the way I am. I accept you too. Viewer discretion advised. Thank you to Scottish UDI for sharing this with me. Dr. Lawrence Dunnigan was a pediatrician in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania for over 34 years. In 1988, he recorded a 2-hour audio cassette recollecting a speech he attended on March 20, 1969 by Dr. Richard Day, with about 75 other doctors. It was a Pittsburgh Pediatric Society meeting of students and health professionals who were destined to be leaders in medicine and healthcare. And after 20 years in 1988, so much of what he heard at that speech had already come true that he felt he had to get the information out there. Ironically enough, Dr. Richard Day, the pediatrician that gave the speech, died the next year. Yeah, his name was Dick Day. Dr. Dick Day. Dick Day was chair of pediatrics at Pitt from 1960 to 1965, and one of the intellectual architects who built the school into the medical research powerhouse it is today. During World War II, Day's work on heat regulation brought him to the attention of the U.S. Army's Climatic Research Laboratory. Officers wanted him to develop protective clothing for troops in sub-zero climates for protracted periods. When Day came to Pitt in 1960, it was with two distinct missions. His first was to help the medical school undergo its transition, a tense one. When he left Pitt in 1965, he accepted the position of medical director of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, quote, because of his strong conviction that overpopulation was arguably the most important problem faced by this planet. He similarly accepted an appointment at Downstate Medical Center out of a desire to train those bringing pediatric services to the less well-off. Day left Planned Parenthood in 1968 to help establish the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. This adds up. The audio cassettes of Dr. Dunnigan are about 2 hours long. I cut them down to about 20 minutes, but I think they're worth a listen.
I want to now describe what I heard from the speaker in 1969, which in several weeks will now be 20 years ago. The speaker did not speak in terms of retrospect, but rather predicting changes that would be brought about in the future. The speaker was not looking from the outside in, thinking that he saw conspiracy. Rather, he was on the inside, admitting that indeed there was an organized power, force, group of men who wielded enough influence to determine major events involving countries around the world. And he expounded on changes that were planned for the remainder of this century. As he put it, we plan to enter the 21st century with a running start. He said, some of you will think I'm talking about communism. What I'm talking about is much bigger than communism. At that time, he indicated there is much more cooperation between East and West than most people realize. In his introductory remarks, he commented that he was free to speak at this time. He would not have been able to say what he was about to say even a few years earlier, but he was free to speak at this time because now, and I'm quoting here, everything is in place and nobody can stop us now. That's the end of that quotation. He went on to say that most people don't understand how governments operate, and even people in high positions in governments, including our own, don't really understand how and where decisions are made. He went on to say that the people who really influence decisions are names that, for the most part, would be familiar to most of us, but he would not use individuals' names or names of any specific organizations. His purpose in telling our group about these changes that were to be brought about was to make it easier for us to adapt to these changes. Indeed, as he quite accurately said, they would be changes that would be very surprising and in some ways difficult for people to accept. And he hoped that we, as sort of his friends, would make the adaptation more easily if we knew somewhat beforehand what to expect. Something in his remarks suggested that there could be negative repercussions against him if it became widely known what he was about to say to our group, if it became widely known that indeed he had spilled the beans, so to speak. One of the statements was having to do with change. People will have to get used to the idea of change, so used to change that they'll be expecting change. Nothing will be permanent. So change was to be brought about, change was to be anticipated and expected and accepted, no questions asked. Another comment that was made, people are too trusting. People don't ask the right questions. Sometimes being too trusting was equated with being too dumb. He said everything has two purposes. One is the ostensible purpose, which will make it acceptable to people. And second is the real purpose, which would further the goals of establishing the new system. He was very active with population control groups, the population control movement, and population control was really the entry point into specifics following the introduction. He said the population is growing too fast. Numbers of people living at any one time on the planet must be limited, or we will run out of space to live. We will outgrow our food supply, and we will overpollute the world with our waste. People won't be allowed to have babies just because they want to or because they are careless. Most families would be limited to 2. Some people would be allowed only 1, and the outstanding person or persons might be selected and allowed to have 3. But most people would allow to have only 2 babies. To me, up to this point, the word population control primarily connoted limiting the number of babies to be born. But this remark about what people would be allowed and then what followed made it quite clear that when you hear population control, that means more than just controlling births. It means control of every endeavor of the entire world population. He said sex must be separated from reproduction. Sex is too pleasurable and the urges are too strong to expect people to give it up. Chemicals in food and in the water supply to reduce the sex drive are not practical. The strategy then would be not to diminish sex activity, but to increase sex activity, but in such a way that people won't be having babies. And the first consideration then here was contraception. Contraception would be very strongly encouraged, and it would be connected so closely in people's minds with sex that they would automatically think contraception when they were thinking or preparing for sex. And contraceptives would be dispensed in the schools in association with sex education. The sex education was to get kids interested early, making the connection between sex and the need for contraception early in their lives, even before they became very active. No surprise then that the next item was abortion. And this, now back in 1969, 4 years before Roe v. Wade, he said abortion will no longer be a crime. Abortion would be accepted as normal and would be paid for by taxes for people who could not pay for their own abortions. Contraceptives would be made available by tax money so that nobody would have to do without contraceptives. If school sex programs would lead to more pregnancies in children, that was really seen as no problem. Parents who think they are opposed to abortion on moral or religious grounds will change their minds when it is their own child who is pregnant. So this will help overcome opposition to abortion. Before long, only a few diehards will still refuse to see abortion as acceptable, and they won't matter anymore. Homosexuality also was to be encouraged. People will be given permission to be homosexuals. That's the way it was stated. They won't have to hide it. Everyone will be given permission to have sex, to enjoy however they want. Anything goes. This is the way it was put. And I remember thinking how arrogant for this individual or whoever he represents to feel that they can give or withhold permission for people to do things. But that was the terminology that was used. Sex and reproduction would be separated. You would have sex without reproduction, and then technology was reproduction without sex. This would be done in the laboratory. Indicated already much research was underway about making babies in the laboratory. Euthanasia. Everybody has a right to live only so long. The old are no longer useful. They become a burden. You should be ready to accept death. An arbitrary age limit could be established. After all, you have a right to only so many steak dinners, so many orgasms, and so many good pleasures in life. And after you've had enough of them, and you're no longer productive in working and contributing, then you should be ready to step aside for the next generation. The next topic is medicine. There would be profound changes in the practice of medicine. Overall, medicine would be much more tightly controlled. The image of the doctor would change. No longer would he be seen as an individual professional in service to individual patients. But the doctor would be gradually recognized as a highly skilled technician, and his job would change. The job is to include things like executions by lethal injection. The image of the doctor as being a powerful, independent person would have to be changed. The solo practitioner would become a thing of the past. A few diehards might try to hold out, but most doctors would be employed by an institution of one kind or another. Group practice would be encouraged, corporations would be encouraged, and then once the corporate image of medical care, as this gradually became more and more acceptable, doctors would more and more become employees rather than independent contractors. And along with that, of course, unstated but necessary, is the employee serves his employer, not his patient. He said there would be new diseases to appear, which had not ever been seen before, would be very difficult to diagnose and be untreatable, at least for a long time. Cancer. He said we can cure almost every cancer right now. Information is on file in the Rockefeller Institute if it's ever decided that it should be released. But consider, if people stop dying of cancer, how rapidly we would become overpopulated. You may as well die of cancer as something else. Efforts at cancer treatment would be geared more toward comfort than toward cure. There was some statement that ultimately the cancer cures which were being hidden in the Rockefeller Institute would come to light because independent researchers might bring them out despite these efforts to suppress them. But at least for the time being, letting people die of cancer was a good thing to do because it would slow down the problem of overpopulation. Another very interesting thing was heart attacks. He said, there is now a way to simulate a real heart attack. It can be used as a means of assassination. Only a very skilled pathologist who knew exactly what to look for at an autopsy could distinguish this from the real thing. I thought that was a very surprising and shocking thing to hear from this particular man at that particular time. This and the business of the cancer cure really still stand out sharply in my memory because they were so shocking and at that time seemed to me out of character.
At one time they wanted me to find out if there was such a thing as a poison that was undetectable, especially one that seemed to mimic a heart attack, that would kill someone, but it would appear that they had a heart attack. I did find such a thing.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
The poison was frozen into some sort of dart, and then it was shot at very high speed into the person. So when it reached the person, it would melt inside them, and the only thing would be like one little tiny red dot on their body, which was hard to detect. There wouldn't be a needle left or anything like that in the person.
He then went on to talk about nutrition and exercise, sort of in the same framework. People would have to eat right and exercise right to live as long as before. Most won't. The convenience foods, though, would be part of the hazard. Anybody who was lazy enough to want the convenience foods rather than fixing his own also better be energetic enough to exercise, because if he was too lazy to exercise and too lazy to fix his own food, then he didn't deserve to live very long. This was all presented as sort of a moral judgment about people and what they should do with their energies. People who are smart, who would learn about nutrition, and who are disciplined enough to eat right and exercise right are better people and are the kind you want to live longer. Another area of discussion was religion, and he said religion is not necessarily bad. A lot of people seem to need religion with its mysteries and rituals, so they will have religion. But the major religions of today have to be changed because they are not compatible with the changes to come. The old religions will have to go, especially Christianity. Once the Roman Catholic Church is brought down, the rest of Christianity will follow easily. Then a new religion can be accepted for use all over the world. It will incorporate something from all of the old ones to make it more easy for people to accept it and feel at home in it. Most people won't be too concerned with religion. They will realize that they don't need it. In order to do this, the Bible will be changed. It will be rewritten to fit the new religion. Gradually, key words will be replaced with new words having various shades of meaning. Then the meaning attached to the new word can be close to the old word, and as time goes on, other shades of meaning of that word can be emphasized, and then gradually that word replaced with another word. I don't know if I'm making that clear, but the idea is that everything in Scripture need not be rewritten, just key words replaced by other words, and the variability in meaning attached to any word can be used as a tool to change the entire meaning of Scripture and therefore make it acceptable to this new religion. Most people won't know the difference, and this was another one of the times where he said the few who do notice the difference won't be enough to matter. In addition to changing the Bible, he said that classics in literature would be changed. I seem to recall Mark Twain's writings was given as one example, but he said the casual reader reading a revised version of a classic would never even suspect there was any change, and somebody would have to go through word by word to even recognize that any change was made in these classics. The changes would be so subtle, but the changes would be such as to promote the acceptability of the new system. He said some books would just disappear from libraries. This was in the vein that some books contain information or contain ideas that should not be kept around, and therefore those books would disappear. Further down the line, not everybody will be allowed to own books, and some books nobody will be allowed to own. Antitrust laws would be changed or be interpreted differently, or both. In connection with the changing antitrust laws, there was some statement that, in a sense, competition would be increased. But this would be increased competition within otherwise controlled circumstances. So it's not a free competition. Drug use would be increased, alcohol abuse would be increased, and law enforcement efforts against drugs would be increased. On first hearing that, it sounded like a contradiction. Why increase drug abuse and simultaneously increase law enforcement against drug abuse? In part, the increased availability of drugs would provide a sort of law of the jungle, whereby the weak and the unfit would be selected out. There was a statement made at that time, before the earth was overpopulated, there was a law of the jungle where only the fittest survived. You had to be able to protect yourself against the elements and wild animals and disease, and if you were fit, you survived. But now that we've become so civilized, we're over-civilized, and the unfit are unable to survive only at the expense of those who are more fit. And the abuse of drugs then would restore, in a certain sense, the law of the jungle and selection of the fittest for survival. There was some discussion about hunting. Not surprisingly, hunting requires guns, and gun control is a big element in these plans. And the idea is that gun ownership is a privilege and not everybody should have guns, and hunting was an inadequate excuse for owning guns, and everybody should be restricted in gun ownership. The few privileged people who should be allowed to hunt could maybe rent or borrow a gun from official quarters rather than own their own. After all, everybody doesn't have a need for a gun, was the way it was put. People would need permission to travel, and they would need a good reason to travel. If you didn't have a good reason for your travel, you would not be allowed to travel. And everyone would need ID. This would at first be an ID card you would carry on your person, and you must show when you're asked for it. It was already planned that later on some sort of device would be developed to be implanted under the skin that would be coded specifically to identify the individual. This would eliminate the possibility of false ID and also eliminate the possibility of people saying, well, I lost my ID. Food supply would come under tight control. If population growth didn't slow down, food shortages could be created in a hurry, and people would realize the dangers of overpopulation. Whether the population slows down or not, though, the food supply is to be brought under centralized control. People would have enough to be well-nourished, but they would not have enough to support any fugitive from the new system. And growing one's own food would be outlawed. This would be done under some sort of pretext. In the beginning, I mentioned there were two purposes for everything. One, the ostensible purpose, and two, the real purpose. And an ostensible purpose here would be that growing your own vegetables was unsafe, it would spread disease or something like that. So the acceptable idea was to protect the consumer, but the real idea is to limit the food supply, and growing your own food would be illegal. And if you persist in illegal activities like growing food, then you're a criminal. One statement, people can carry in their minds and act upon two contradictory ideas at the same time, provided these two contradictory ideas are kept far enough apart. The other statement is you can know pretty well how rational people are going to respond to certain circumstances or to certain information that they encounter. So to determine the response you want, you need only control the kind of data or information that they are presented or the kinds of circumstances they're in. And being rational people, they'll do what you want them to do. They may not fully understand what they're doing or why. Somewhere in this connection then was a statement admitting that some scientific research data could be, and indeed has been, falsified in order to bring about desired results. People don't ask the right questions. Some people are too trusting. Now, this was an interesting statement because the speaker and the audience, all being doctors of medicine and supposedly very objectively, dispassionately scientific, and science being the be-all and end-all, well, to falsify data, scientific research data, in that setting is like blasphemy in the church. You just don't do that. Electronic payments initially would all be based on different kinds of credit cards. These were already in use in 1969 to some extent, not as much as now. And once they got used to that, then it would be pointed out the advantage of having all of this combined into a single credit card serving a single monetary system, and then you don't have to carry around all that plastic. And then the next step would be to replace the single card with a skin implant. And the skin implant, of course, would have to be put somewhere that was convenient to the scanner, for example, your right hand or your forehead. At that time when I heard this, I was unfamiliar with the statements in the book of Revelation. The speaker went on to say, now some of you people who read the Bible will attach significance to this, but he went on to disclaim any biblical significance at all. This is just common sense of how the system could work and should work, and there's no need to read any superstitious biblical principles into it. As I say, at the time I was not very familiar with the words of Revelation. Shortly after that I became familiar with them, and the significance of what he said really was striking. I'll never forget it. When the new system takes over, people will be expected to sign allegiance to it, indicating they don't have any reservations or holding back to the old system.
And you pick the people to run those agencies and the deputies that are pledging allegiance to the New World Order and good governance?
There just won't be any room, he said, for people who won't go along. We can't have such people cluttering up the place, so such people would be taken to special places. And here I don't remember the exact words, but the inference I drew was that at these special places where they were taken, then they would not live very long. The system was not going to support them when they would not go along with the system. That would leave death as the only alternative.
Fucking stoned.
I got